Greetings, everyone. Rob Chassner here, continuing in our study of the book of Hebrews, verse by verse. And if you're following along, this study will begin in chapter 12 with verse 16. Hebrews 12, verse 16. The last time we were together, we made it through verse 15. Now, there's a lot of warnings in life. We are constantly reminded of warnings. If you've ever been in downtown, let's say Atlanta, and you pull into a parking lot where you buy a ticket from the machine and you put that on your dash. And so in order to make sure that you put it in the right spot, you go over to another car and you see that they put their ticket in, where they put it, and you notice that there might be a cardboard sunscreen to protect and cover the windshield and the dash. And if you look at the sunscreen closely, you'll notice that there's a warning which says do not use this screen while operating a vehicle. Now, you have to think that there was some kind of a lawsuit behind that warning where some idiot was driving with the screen covering his vision, and he wrecked the car, and the lawsuit pursued and followed. Now, there are restaurants and coffee shops that have to put warnings on their coffee cups that the contents of the cup is hot, because some people are so uninformed to know that fresh brewed coffee is hot. And you know that we are in a very litigious, happy culture. There is a lawsuit filed every 2 seconds in our country every year. There is one lawsuit filed for every 12 Americans. And what are the downsides for this? Other than making the costs of goods and services more expensive for all of us, because companies don't pay the high costs of litigation, the consumers do through the raising of the prices of products and services. So besides making things more expensive for us, this makes us callous to legitimate signs and legitimate warnings. For example, a plastic bag is not a toy. Do not put it over your head or you'll suffocate. We are just warned about all of these dumb things that we should already know to be truth. And when there's a legitimate warning, we tend not to take heed or think about it. And we just think of them as silly warnings. Now, the writer here in verse 15 has given us a very serious warning, which is do not allow bitterness to take root within your life. There is enough disappointment, enough hurt, there's enough injustice going on in the world to supply us with enough raw material to cause us to become angry and bitter for the rest of our lives. You are not the only one who has been hurt, and you are not the only one who has been lied about, and you're not the only one who has been ripped off. You're not the only one who deals with poor health. These things happen in some form to all of us. So the writer is telling us if you do not get over it and begin to move on with the rest of your life, that very ugly things that will begin to happen. And if you don't get over your bitterness, he now intensifies this warning as we get into verse 16. So if you don't have your Bibles, I'll put the verses in the box below this video. Press pause and read verses 15, 16, and 17, and then press play once again. With the exception of Judas, the most profane man in the Bible has got to be Esau. And apparently at some point, Esau became a bitter person. Here is what bitterness does. A bitter person becomes a self-absorbed person. A bitter person begins to live life where They are consumed with thoughts of themselves. And you know what it is to run into a person like this in the grocery store or on the street or at church. Within 5 seconds, the conversation is steered into the direction of how they have been hurt or how they've been offended or all the bad things which has upset them in their life this week. And after about 20 minutes, you finally have the ability to break away from this person. And you know as well as I do, as you walk away from that person, you're thinking, I do not really want to have another conversation with that person again. And the fascinating thing about bitter people is that they push and drive other people away. People who care about them, they push them away and they become even more bitter because they have no friends. And they have no friends because nobody wants to listen to a constant discussion about how life has been wrong for them. Your life is not to be consumed with thoughts of yourself. There are larger issues at hand. Now, I know that there are some that say bitterness leads to gun ownership and religion, but notice that the writer says that bitterness leads to two things, and those are not guns and religion. The first thing, it leads to sexual sin, because a bitter person is a selfish person. There is no sin that represents selfishness more than sexual sin. To gratify myself. I don't care who it offends. I don't care what my kids think. I don't care what my spouse thinks. I don't care what anyone thinks about my marriage. I deserve this. I have the right to sin. And God is going to sort of just wink at it because, after all, God owes me for all this pain in my life, all of this heartache that I've had to put up. That leads to sexual sin. Notice the second thing that it leads to is to a person who becomes profane. That word profane means to be outside of the temple, to be away from God. Now, you've been created for God's pleasure. You have been created to do the will of God. You have not been created to constantly satisfy yourself and think about yourself. And if you're living a self-consumed life, that is putting you outside the boundaries of God's plan. If it is putting you away from God, and it's not drawing you closer to God. Now, he says here that Esau, two things here. Notice, first of all, that Esau sold his birthright, and second, he sought the blessing. There were two things that would go on in the life of the Old Testament father. And if I were an Old Testament father and I had one or more sons, there are two things that I would pass on to them when I sense my life is coming to an end. One of them would be the birthright. The birthright was of a spiritual nature. It was going to be the son who would carry the spiritual torch for the family, who is going to be a spiritual leader of the family when I have departed from this earth. There was also a prophetic part of this, the birthright, as well because the father would prophesy that one who received the birthright would also be the one through whom the Messiah would come. The father would say, "You are to take on the spiritual mantle, and through you, the promised Messiah would come." So then the blessing is what we would normally think of as an inheritance. It was money, real estate, family fortune. So I would give out the spiritual blessing and I would give out the material blessing. Now you remember Jacob, Esau's brother, when he sensed that time was drawing near, he called his 12 sons to his bedside and he said to Judah, "You get the birthright. You're going to be the one who will be the spiritual leader of this family, and through Judah would come the promised one." That's the Messiah. And so the titles of the Messiah is that he is the Lamb of the tribe of Judah. And then he turned to his son Joseph and he said to Joseph, "You're getting the blessing." Now, the writer tells us here that Esau sold his birthright for a morsel of food. Esau was an outdoorsman. He was kind of like a Grizzly Adams. And apparently he was not a great hunter. He came back with no prize. His sugar level must have been low. He was probably jittery and lightheaded, and he said to his brother, who, give me some of that red. Well, he was making some kind of chili. Give me some red. He was kind of talked like a Neanderthal, and so he didn't call food by its name in the Hebrew. He says, "Give me some of that red." And Jacob, um, you didn't get anything from him for nothing. So Jacob said, "Well, you'd sell me your birthright." And he wasn't asking for the blessing; he was just asking for the spiritual leadership of the family. And you remember Esau said, "Hey, I'm hungry. I'm starving to death. And what good is my birthright if I die from hunger?" Now later on, he was ripped off. Esau was sort of tricked, and so he lost the blessing. But notice that he was whining about money. He's not whining about the fact that he lost the blessing. So he's a carnal man. He's an absolutely no interest in spiritual things. That is what bitterness can move each of us to. Bitterness can move us to a place where spiritual things no longer have priority in our lives. All right, press pause, read verses 18 to 21, and then play once again. Now, in context, this writer is writing to a group of people who were raised Jewish. They have come to a place where they have accepted Jesus Christ as being the promised Messiah. They're Messianic Jews. Upon receiving Christ, they became greatly persecuted. No doubt they became bitter. Things had not turned out the way they expected. They've come to Christ, all hell breaks loose in their life, you know, and they're thinking, what's up with that? And so some of them are thinking about going back to Judaism, going to go back to the religion that I left. At least back then, I didn't have any grief from my family and friends and coworkers. Notice that the writer is saying, "Let me give you a little refresher course on your history. You want to go back to the law? You want to go back to Mount Sinai? Well, let's talk about what happened at Mount Sinai. When God came down from the top of the mountain, God said to Israel, I'm going to give you my word. I'm going to give you my law. I want you to fast. I want you to pray. I want this to be serious business." And for several days, the entire nation sought God. And for 3 days, God descended on the top of the mountain, and Mother Nature went kind of crazy. The mountain was teetering. The earth was quaking. The sky was filled with blackness and smoke. Now, think about this. We are oftentimes held captive by Bible movies, and sometimes we get our doctrine based upon a Bible movie, and we have to see the Ten Commandments uh, and Charlton Heston on the top of the mountain. And with the technology that movies have, we have this fake looking fire. We have the carving of the Ten Commandments on what looks like fake stone. And we walk away from the movie thinking, well, Charlton Heston is the only one who heard God's voice. And and that's really not what happened. The entire assembly of Israel heard the voice of God when Moses was on top of the mountain. Now, you think about this, many Bible scholars say that the encampment of Israel expanded over several hundred square miles. When they were on the move, you're talking about a line that stretches, let's say, from Atlanta to Asheville. It was a huge undertaking. And what kind of voice would thunder over a few hundred miles? After God's voice thundered forth, the heads of the tribes came to Moses and said, "We don't want to hear this anymore. You go up to the top, back up to the top of the mountain and tell God that if we hear this one more time, we might die from heart attacks. You listen to God, you hear God, and come back and tell us what he said." Now, the writer is telling us, uh, is that what you want to go back to? You want to go back to a relationship with God where everyone is scared to death? Uh, they were scared out of their Hirachi sandals as the voice of God was thundering, and we have turned into turned God into a jolly like grandfather figure that is out to make everyone happy and doesn't have anything negative to say about anything. The Bible tells us that God, our God, is a man of war, and he wars against all who are in opposition to God's character and God's nature. And to stand naked before God outside the grace of Jesus Christ is a straight shot into judgment. And the writer is telling us, uh, is this the kind of relationship that you want to go back to? All right, press pause and read verses 22 to 24, and then press play once again. So instead of a tale of two cities, we really have a tale of two mountains. Now, the two mountains, which of these two mountains do you really want to dwell upon? Do you want to dwell on Mount Sinai, the mountain of works, the mountain of self effort, the mountain of you going to earn a standing before God? Or do you want to dwell on the Mount of Zion, the mountain of grace? Notice that he tells us we are going to be dwelling in the presence of God, and yet we are not going to be filled with fear. We're not going to be hiding our faces from God. And the reason for this is that we are going to be people who are made perfect. Jude tells us that Jesus is going to be present, is going to present us with exceeding joy before the Father, being completely perfect in the eyes of God. And when the Lord is through with you, you're going to be as righteous as Jesus Christ. And so, which of these two mountains do you want to dwell? The mountain of works or the mountain of grace? And so, notice that he says, "You have come." This is past tense. You're already there. It is what Paul tells us in Ephesians. You are seated with Christ in the heavenly places. We are. Why are we perfect? What did he say about the blood of Christ? It does not speak about Abel's blood. Um, what did Abel's blood speak? God said to Abel's brother Cain, Abel's blood is speaking to me. What was it speaking? It was speaking vengeance. It was speaking judgment. Um, avenge what has happened. Now, does the blood of Christ speak that? No. What does the blood of Christ speak? What did Jesus say when he was bleeding this blood? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. You and I will be standing before the judge of the universe, absolutely perfect, with no fear, no trembling, because of the perfect word of the blood of Jesus Christ. I press pause and read verses 25 through 26 and then play once again. This is a classic lesser to greater argument. What he is saying here is, if they did not get away with blowing off the words of Moses, well, how much trouble will we face if we blow off the words of God? If the gospel is the greater privilege imaginable, could we therefore not say that the rejection or refusal of the gospel is the greatest sin imaginable? And if they did not get away with violating the law of Moses, how do we ever expect to get away with violating the truth that has been given to us through or by Jesus Christ? I press pause and read verses 27 and 28 and then press play again. Sorry, 27 to 29 and then press play. Now, the word grace there, it has the meaning of gratitude. Whatever you perceive your service to God is, however you see yourself as a witness, well, I'm a witness at work, or I'm a witness at school, or I'm a missionary. Whatever form you perceive that you are serving God, that is not to be looked as being payback. I am paying God for what I am receiving from him. You cannot pay God back. What God is requesting here is that we give grace, and that word grace has the meaning of gratitude. All God is looking for from you and me is a little thank you, a little gratitude. Now, this is the difference between a bitter person and a person who has been delivered from bitterness. A bitter person is most unthankful, the most unthankful person that you're ever going to run into. They're living their lives in direct opposition of the way of the Word of God is commanding them to live their lives. And so the writer is saying to these people that may be getting a little bitter, he is saying, get over it. Begin to move on with your lives and begin to become people of gratitude. Notice he says, live before God in reverence and fear. There should be a continual state of mind blownness. We live our lives with blown minds. I cannot believe how good God is. I cannot believe how gracious God is, how merciful God is. How different of an attitude is this than going around saying, I've been ripped off. Let me tell you how you cannot trust anybody. Let me tell you how you cannot have eyes in the back of your head because everybody is out to get you. What a difference in how we are to live our lives. And he wraps this up by saying, for our God is a consuming fire. In the second century, there was a guy in the church by the name of Marcion, and he is the father of what's known as Marcionism. Go figure that. And what Marcionism taught us was that there are two gods. There is a God of the Old Testament, very cranky guy who gets ticked off in a heartbeat. And then there's the God of the New Testament, a kinder, more gentle version of what we have in the Old Testament. And therefore, our relationship is to be with the New Testament God and not with the Old Testament God. And therefore, Christians are not to read the Old Testament. That's Marcionism. Christians are not to read any of the Gospels. Except certain parts of Luke, and they're not to read the letters of Paul because he was the apostle specifically to the ministering of the Gentiles. But notice how the writer words it here. Notice that he says, our God. He is talking to New Testament believers. And so he is talking to the New Testament about the New Testament God. And he says that the New Testament God, that he is a consuming fire. And one day, this New Testament God is going to shake everything that can be shaken. He is not just to shake the earth, but he is going to shake the heavens as well. And our response to this God of fire is what he says in verse 28. Let's serve God. In other words, serve there means worship. Worship God with an obedient heart, a grateful heart, reverent heart, and the reason is our God is a consuming fire. In the Old Testament, the city of Jerusalem was surrounded by the Assyrian army. Hezekiah was the king of Israel. The prophet came to the king and said, do not sweat it. God is going to take care of these guys. The next morning, Israel wakes up and looks over the walls, and there lying outside the city were 185,000 Assyrian soldiers dead. And Isaiah told us that some of the soldiers inside the city walls of Jerusalem who were not right with God, who can dwell in the presence of consuming fire, who can escape who can escape this consuming fire is the question. Fire is an interesting thing. Fire can either consume or fire can make permanent. It all depends on what it's introduced to, the fire. You take a bag of trash, you throw it in the incinerator or the trash barrel, you start it on fire, the trash is consumed. You take metal alloy and you subject it to fire, it hardens, it makes it more durable, it makes it more lasting. Now, the question is not who can escape the fire of God, because the reality is no one can escape it. You're going to stand before God. I'm going to stand before God. The Bible says it is appointed unto humans once to die and then the judgment. And so the question is not who is going to escape, because nobody will escape. The question is, what are you? Are you going to be subjected to the fire of God, or are you a child of God who is or are you a child of someone else? If you're a child of God, there is a fire of God is burning in our lives, and some of the fire we can become angry with. We can become bitter. We can realize that God is putting me in a press. God is dealing with me. God is changing me. God is bringing out the spiritual qualities in a more permanent fashion in my life. Or if you're not a child of God, then you're going to be consumed by the fire of God. Each of us will stand before God. And so, therefore, the question we must ask, whose child am I? If you're a child of God, do not become bitter, but allow God's chastisement to do its work. And if you're not a child of God, then you turn to God, you turn to the Lord, you receive the free grace of God, and you allow Him to change your life, change your heart, so that you can escape the judgment to come. Amen. All right, I hope this has been helpful and informative. Our next study will begin in chapter 13 of Hebrews. If you know someone that would benefit from watching this Bible study video, feel free to forward it to them. Thank you for viewing, and good day.